All right. Well, hello, Professor McElhenney. I'm Colin Gasper, and I'm going to attempt to successfully complete my first ever video essay for your class. Hopefully, it will be more successful than some of my previous, works. But I think we're just going to be best off if we dive right in. To start a conversation between The Night of the Living Dead by George A. Romero and Sweetbacks Badass Song by Melvin Van Peebles. Um, I think it's important to sort of establish a base for both movies. Starting off with Night of the Living Dead, the introduction, you see Johnny and Barbara pulling into the cemetery to place the wreath on their father's grave, and immediately there's a callback, to their childhood fear of the cemetery and how they used to, tease each other back then. And the following scene where Johnny is teasing Barbara is a, a really interesting segue into the whole apocalyptic setting that is, obviously the main conflict of the whole film. Um, the one aspect that I found to be interesting in this film was that, especially in the beginning, the use of music was sort of the primary way to create suspense and drama, as opposed to modern day use of special effects or makeup. Actually, the first zombie that you see shambling up to them, I was confused if that was even a zombie. I was sort of, I thought he might have been a regular guy because he just didn't really have makeup. He was walking a little bit funny, but, you know, uh, definitely a different time, and, shows the age of the movie. Um, so, um, so one of the, another unique aspect to the Night of the Living Dead that I think you touched on briefly in your analysis of it was the zombies' use of tools. And, you know, there are many successive uh, zombie films and, flicks and the Walking Dead series and etc. I could go on, but not many do you see, zombies that are capable of using bricks and picking up, the torch that Ben dropped to bang on the door. And that, I think, created a pretty interesting dynamic in this movie, for the sense that normally, the humans being able to use tools and weapons against the zombies is sort of what sets them above and gives them the sense of hope. And, these zombies aren't fast as featured in some other, more recent films, but it does definitely close the gap of capability between, the undead and the humans, and also add to the suspense of the movie. Um, so, to begin to touch on Sweetback's Badass Song, um, I noticed that, there's a 3 year difference in the time that these movies were released, and there was definitely uh, quite a distinct difference in the display of violence between the two. Sweetbacks was rated X in the beginning by an all-white jury, as they said, and the scenes of sexuality in that movie out the gate are just so far beyond anything that you even saw in Night of the Living Dead. Like I said, it's a 3 year difference, but you can really see, at no point in Night of the Living Dead was anyone even showing a modicum of skin. Everyone was buttoned up and very, professionally dressed to match the time. And I think that's one way that, it is dated. However, the difference in violence between the two movies, I mean, I know that I touched on that makeup and effects weren't used as much in the beginning of Night of the Living Dead, but towards the end, after Tom and Judy's death, you do see the zombies up close, and they have the makeup, the faces are peeling, and they're eating the hands and, picking apart flesh and stuff. Also, you know, the desecration of the bodies, Ben burning the zombies, um, was very different from the violence you see in Sweetback's Badass Song. It, especially one scene that stood out to me in that movie was, you know, when he's hiding in the shed with his one companion, and the cops find them. You know, the violence was very clearly like faked. The punches were not hitting. You know, the handcuffs, he was choking him to the left of his neck. You know, the difference in violence is pretty great. You know, as opposed to Night of the Living Dead, where they're bashing their brains in and shooting them in the head. You know, so I think, you know, the perspective ratings and you know, the societal differences between the two movies over a 3 year gap is definitely something interesting for me to see. Um, so one thing that was sort of commonplace between the two movies that I picked up on was, you know, definitely the presence of existing gender norms from the time in both movies. You know, uh, while in Sweetback was sort of a hypersexualized, almost like the black buck that we looked at before. However, you know, most of the women in the movie were portrayed as, you know, sexual objects, and really didn't have much of a function outside of that. Um, Similarly, in Night of the Living Dead, almost every woman in the cast was portrayed as almost useless. You know, Barbara is catatonic, the whole movie throughout. Really doesn't contribute to the team at all. Judy, when she does try to contribute and run after Tom, she ends up getting them both killed. Um, you know, even Mrs. Cooper was, you know, caring for her daughter the whole time, and then at the end, you know, she falls down and just lays there completely helpless while her child comes up and just, you know, stabs her, when she should have easily been able to, you know, defend herself or protect herself. So I think, you know, the ideal of, you know, women being less useful and sort of a you know, not like a sidekick, but sort of a counterpart to the male figures is definitely present in both of these films. Um, However, in the Grant reading, it did touch on a fact that, you know, especially in the Night of the Living Dead, the men were just as much of a threat to life as the zombies. You know, there's definitely this tension throughout Night of the Living Dead that it's sort of a more implicit tension, but, you know, you can tell Mr. Cooper does not like taking orders from a black man. You know, Ben, the main protagonist of the movie, he's, you know, fighting him about staying upstairs, and he fights him about, you know, oh, he didn't do a good enough job boarding the windows, and he's not, you know, capable of doing the job and sort of leading the team. And that was sort of, you can feel that it's sort of a racially motivated tension. um, and especially in the scene where he, you know, doesn't open the door for Ben, and Ben has to kick the door down. You know, this ensuing scuffle ends up with Mr. Cooper dead, and really doesn't benefit the team in any way. Um, let's see. Um, so, uh, so I did think that, you know, the difference, uh, there are a lot of similarities between the two movies, especially, you know, even in their post production and, you know, showings. They were both relatively cheaply made movies that were based off of, you know, implementing the dynamic shots and, you know, lots of different shots, which for me sort of detracts from the movie because I'm used to these modern streamlined movies. Um, but these are both, I mean, Sweetback is definitely a staple film of blaxploitation. You know, it was funded by a $50,000 grant from Bill Cosby to Melvin Van Peebles, and ended up, you know, amassing more than $10 million following its debut in theaters. Um, However, though, while there was, you know, definitely a feeling of racial tension in both movies, um, you know, I felt it more in Sweetback's Badass Song, and in my opinion, that might be because of the fact that, you know, Van Peebles um, directed that one, and as a black man himself, I think he could sort of relate more to, you know, what he was feeling and pour that into the characters of his movie, whereas Romero was, you know, a white producer, even though the film was earlier in a more racially fueled time. um, I felt the racism more in Sweetback's Badass Song because, you know, it was just so abundantly evident throughout the movie, the hate speech in the characters and in the music. You know, one thing I jotted down was the song where they say it's Whitey's game, and you know, the whole time, like the um, the language of the citizens, especially the cops too. You know, it just their language is in no means limited, and it's in no, you know, it's very degrading to some of the, intentionally degrading to some of the characters. Um, However, I do think that, you know, for the time, Sweetback's Badass Song had a rather astounding diversity in its characters. You know, when they're asking around about Sweetback's whereabouts, you know, they ask the gays. You know, they show like whites who aren't racist. In contrast, you know, the guy he paid $5 for to just keep running if anyone followed him. You know, instead of using the language that the cops would use or other citizens even would use to describe him, he was like, oh, you know, he looks like a buddy I used to pal around with in high school. And he in no way described him, you know, as some of the other characters would. um, you know, in that movie, even the ending line contained hate speech, and, you know, I was sort of surprised that that made it into production. I mean, I'm sure it was a more liberal time as far as what people could say in that aspect. Um, the last thing I wanted to touch on in comparison of the two movies is the fact of what is acceptable at those times for society to see as far as violence goes. Um, in Night of the Living Dead, the undead are, you know, not human. They're so, you know, the shooting them in the head and bashing their brains in and burning them was sort of, I believe, why it, you know, got through and through production and everything, was because, you know, they're not human. So based on that premise, you know, the violence is not as intense, so to say, I guess, because like I said in Sweetbacks, the violence was definitely, you know, decreased. Or it was, you know, not as well produced or as graphic, as far as when it was person to person. However, you know, when he's in the desert, he finds that lizard and just cuts its head off. They show the whole thing, it's pouring blood, and he just starts biting out of it. The ending scene, you know, there's the dogs floating in the river that are stabbed up and covered in blood. And it's just sort of interesting to see, at least in my perspective, you know, that it's okay to show brutality towards animals and other things, you know, as long as they're not human. It's sort of passed at that time. So that was definitely an interesting dynamic between the two movies, and I appreciate them both for what they are. However, they not particularly my cup of tea with the shooting style, but I appreciate them for what they are.